So as I mentioned in the last video, the rudder's been done for several weeks now. A lot of stuff going on with work and other things, just haven't had the time to really sit down and put all that video together. But finishing up kind of a really long overnight here in Denver, and so finally got the time to get it all done and get it out there for you. So that's coming up on this video. You get a good look at the entire process, start to finish, building the rudder for the RV14. I think the lesson that I learned in this process is that no matter how few pages there are in the instructions or how small or simple the part is, when you factor in all the deburring and everything else that goes into it, it takes a while to get it all done. So my original plan on this was, do a video start to finish and then release that, thinking it wouldn't take that long. So going forward, my plan is I'm gonna film as I work on each section, and then at the end of a week or so, whenever I've got a nice break, I'll just take what I've covered to that point and I'll compile that into a nice video, and that way you'll kind of see some steady progress instead of having to wait weeks to see what I've been up to. So without any further ado, here's the construction of the rudder for my RV14. Enjoy. So just got off the phone with Vans a few minutes ago. I had a question about one of the things in here, but then I had a general question. So when I put the vertical stabilizer together, the normal process there, your Cleco and stuff together, match drilling and final drilling all the holes, disassembly, put it back together, rivet it together. So I started to get to that phase here on the rudder project and Clecoed a bunch of this stuff together and noticed the Clecos were going in a lot easier than they were in the vertical stabilizer on the parts before they were final drilled. So I grabbed a drill bit on the back end just to test the size. Turns out it's all been final drilled. I knew a lot of the RV10, RV14s were now, the holes were coming final sized, which was what surprised me a little bit when I did vertical stabilizer, that those weren't. But I just got off the phone with them and confirmed it. He said, yeah, most of the kit should be final sized. So in the instructions, it still says to go ahead and final drill the holes after you've Clecoed them together and then take them apart, deburr and all that. But the good news is, at least so far for the rudder, and I'll verify other parts as I progress, but looks like this section of it, not a lot of holes that are going to need to be drilled out. Everything, I checked it with a drill bit, then I went ahead and put an actual rivet in the hole just to kind of triple check and make sure that all the holes are the final size. And it seems like most of them are. So that's good news. It'll save me a little bit of time on that. Cool. So in order to make a completed rudder emerge from this set of plans, the first step, as is often the case, involves cutting or separating large pieces of aluminum into smaller pieces. Most of the aluminum parts for the kit are stamped out by a press at Vans. And when they're making a lot of small pieces, it's often more efficient to stamp them out as a single piece, which will need to be trimmed or separated by the builder. So I begin by separating the single piece into what will become 7 shear clips. These will be used in the assembly to join the left and right stiffeners to create internal ribs for the rudder. Similarly, the stiffeners will have to be separated and then also trimmed and shaped. As you can see here, part of each stiffener was stamped out with part of the correct angle, but the ends need to be cut to extend the angle all the way to the end. With all of these pieces, I start by making a rough cut with a bandsaw, just a little bit away from the line, and then I'll use a Scotch-Brite wheel to carefully grind the excess away and bring it right up to the line. And then, of course, I'll spend a great deal of time deburring all of the edges of each piece. The end result looks something like this. The next step involves a lot of prep work, and then Clecoing together all the primary components that attach the rudder to the spar. This includes the large half of the bottom rib, the reinforcement plates, and the rudder horn. They'll all get match drilled where needed, and the top ribs have their corners shaped for the initial test fit assembly with the skins. As you can see here, the top of the rudder has some ribs which extend out above the vertical stabilizer. Just below this extension in the top rib is a counterbalance rib, which, as the name suggests, holds a lead weight to help stabilize the rudder and prevent any fluttering during flight. The weight itself gets drilled out for screws, and the rib is countersunk and prepped for nut plates, which will hold the counterweight in place later on. So as I mentioned, everything's been final drilled for the most part, but always good to double check, because I've just found out this piece here, the holes in the spar are final drilled, but the holes in this rib right here are not. It was a little tough getting those in there. So like I said, most of the stuff, it seems like, is and should be final drilled, but occasionally you're still going to come across a part that's not. The other thing you're going to have to do in the instructions, there's a couple spots where you're going to enlarge some holes but not others. So for example, in the skins, the rudder skins, all the holes in there are all final sized, but the instructions specifically call out for 2 holes near the top to actually get upsized from that. So can't just completely ignore everywhere that it says to final drill. Still have to kind of double check as I go along, but a lot of the work definitely has been done, which also means most of these holes, because they're final sized, they actually don't need to be deburred either. I'll double check them all, but for the most part, they all feel pretty smooth, so save a little bit of work. So far with the rudder, I've got the first couple pages in the instructions done, and that basically led me to everything that you see here. Kind of the next step where I'm at right now is I would take the spar, and there's some doublers and things that I would go ahead and rivet to the spar, finalize that piece of it, and then use that as a guide to match up the skins, and basically prep to go ahead and back rivet all of these stiffeners onto the rudder skin itself. But I'm going to prime everything, so I don't want to rivet anything together until I've primed everything. So I'm going to go a little bit out of order here. What I'm going to do is, instead of riveting everything together on the spar, I will cleco the spar together to get everything aligned with the skin and make sure everything's all lined up, and kind of take it to that phase in the assembly where I would then take it all back apart just before I start to rivet all the stiffeners onto the skin. Those are going to get back riveted on there. So once I get all that done, I'll go ahead and disassemble everything, prime all the parts for the rudder, and then once that's done, we'll reassemble and rivet together. Be done before I know it. The stiffeners are joined together as respective left and right halves, and then attached to the spar with the shear clips. This basically creates a 3-part rib-like assembly, which forms most of the structural skeleton inside the rudder. Where the rudder skins overlap at the front of the top and the counterbalance ribs, the instructions call for a very small amount of skin to be trimmed away. It's only about 3/32 of an inch. I decided to use shears to make the cut on these edges, and I'm glad I did. It would have been very hard to maneuver the skins on the bandsaw, and the shears make a smoother cut. Unfortunately, as you can see here, I stood right in front of the camera as I made the cut. And again, I made the cut just a little bit outside of the line, and then used the 3M wheel to grind down the excess. Once that's complete and the edges are deburred, the edge of the top skin, where the 2 overlap, gets a slight bend rolled into it to keep the edge flush once it's all riveted together. So to set it up, basically you open this up so that when it closes, it's got a gap. Put it down here, you're going to let the edge of the metal not get up in this bend here, but just in this flat part. Close it, and then holding it there, you just tighten the screw up till the two parts just touch together with a little bit of light pressure. Open it, turn this about maybe an eighth or a quarter of the turn, and lock it down, and that should give you that little bit of extra tension. Then when you put it in the metal, now you're going to have the metal edge all the way up to this edge, which is going to allow you to get that little bit of a bend from this wheel as you pull it along one way, then put it on, and then push back to finish off the other edge. You don't want to start right at the corner. Start near a corner, but leave a little bit of space. Pull it all the way one way, then push it off the other edge. So in this next step, I'm mounting the trailing edge piece for the rudder to the back of the rudder skin. You do that, you line it up with the clecos, and then you'll trim off the edge of it here to make it fit. And then the next step in that is to go ahead and match drill all the holes for this. And what they tell you is you want to be perpendicular to the cord line that runs right through that angled piece. So with it sitting on the table, you'd actually have your drill on a little bit of an angle, but I've got the whole thing sitting up on wood and it's kind of creating the opposite angle here. So I'll be going almost perpendicular to the surface, which is basically what you want. You want perpendicular to the cord line that would kind of bisect that. The bottom assembly, made up of the bottom half ribs, attached ribs, and the rudder horn, is also assembled at this point, clecoed together, and then drilled as needed. Each half of the rudder skin now gets clecoed to the ribs and the spar and the trailing edge wedge for any required final drilling. At this point, the whole thing gets pulled back apart, and all the edges and any holes that needed to be drilled will get deburred so that everything is ready to go to priming. And now the C-frame comes out to dimple the skins for the number 3 flush head rivets. And similarly, the spar, ribs, stiffeners, everything else gets dimpled as well. As is often the case, there's a number of holes which are not supposed to be dimpled or riveted, so those I'll cover up with some painter's tape to make sure I don't screw that up along the way. This trailing edge wedge needs to be countersunk to accept the dimples in the trailing edge of the skins. To do this, Vans has instructions to create a jig to make sure that the countersunk holes are perpendicular to the surface on each side of the wedge. But Cleveland Aircraft Tools fortunately sells a pre-made jig for this specific task, so I just bought that and it works great. Now that I've got all the priming complete, I'll go back to the instructions that I marked earlier on page 5, and I'll complete the assembly riveting together all the spar substructure. This will also involve adding some nut plates to the spar, which later on are going to be used to attach brackets, which will actually connect the rudder to the vertical stabilizer. So now that I've got the main spar riveted together for the rudder, the next step is to put the stiffeners on the rudder skins, which are what I've got set up behind me here. So to do that, I'll be back riveting the stiffeners onto the sheets, which is something I don't think I've done on the project so far. So it's a type of riveting that I enjoy doing for a couple different reasons. One, you get to use the rivet gun, which is always fun because power tool. Unlike back riveting, where you've got the rivet gun in one hand and a bucking bar on the other hand, trying to stabilize material in between the two, and often, not a lot of room to get your fingers up and manipulate the bucking bar on the back side, so it's a little bit tricky. With back riveting, We're actually going to put a metal plate underneath the back of the skin itself. We can line up a whole bunch of rivets in a row, and then we take the rivet gun with a back rivet set, and instead of using the rivet gun on the head of the rivet like you normally do in the bucking bar to mash down the shank of the rivet, the head of the rivet is sitting on the metal bar, and you just take this back rivet head and you mash down the shank of the rivet, which is awesome because it goes a lot faster. It's a little bit harder to screw this one up, which is also good, but it's just a lot of fun. So let's do that. Next up, the instructions call for the small half of the bottom rib to get riveted to the right rudder skin. And I'll also rivet the corresponding shear clips to their respective stiffeners on that same right rudder skin. It's important for the stability of the airplane to have the trailing edge of the rudder as straight as possible. When the trailing edge wedge gets riveted together, there's a potential to create some waviness between the rivets. So to help prevent this, Vans instructs you to use some special 3M double-sided tape to adhere the wedge to the skin where it's going to be riveted. They used to tell you to use fuel tank sealant for this step, but they're now recommending this specific 3M tape. I think it's because it was too easy to use too much of that tank sealant, which was also kind of a mess. This tape is very thin. It's not really like tape at all. Once it goes on there and the two protective sides are peeled off, it's basically just like painting on a thick, sticky adhesive. There's no solid backing like you get, with normal Scotch tape or anything like that. Anyway, I found some of this on Amazon, but in reading through some of the comments from people that purchased it there, it sounds like what I'd be receiving was some stuff that was a little bit way past its expiration date. There was even a comment there from one individual that actually said, RV builders, look elsewhere for this. So I did a quick Google search and ended up ordering some from Uline, and I was really happy with the result. Good stuff. So after prepping the surface of the skin and the wedge, the tape gets applied to the wedge with the protective coating still on the outside. And then the wedge gets clecoed to the right skin. Put the clecos on the outside, obviously. And I put a cleco in every hole so it's nice and firm all the way across. Next up, the two halves of the rudder get riveted together. It's basically like trying to close up a giant zipper. So you use pull rivets during this process for the internal part where you're joining up the shear clips and the stiffeners, thankfully. There's really no other way to get in there and put rivets. The skin's really flexible, so it's not too terribly difficult to bend one side back and then eventually bring the sides together while you're putting the rivets in there. At least not once you've got the first one done. It's a pretty tight fit in there, and squeezing my hand in there, it kept pushing the two pieces apart when I was trying to get the clecos in there. The problem with riveting the first of these together is that with so much of the top skin rolled back, the weight of that wants to let the whole thing roll off the table. So I got a little help holding that in place just to get the first rib structure clecoed all together. And after that, the rest go much easier. Another issue is that when you get the rivet squeezer in there, you want to make sure the rivet is flush before you start squeezing. However, when you push down to make sure the rivet head's fitting nice and flush, everything wants to slide away from you. So eventually, I wised up and I put something against the bottom edge of the entire rudder structure so it couldn't slide away from me. And that made things go a lot easier. So starting at one end, I'll remove a handful of the clecos from the wedge on the right skin. Then I reach in, peel back the tape between the stiffener and the next one that I'm about to rivet. So if you hold that tape covering just a about at a 90-degree angle, maybe a little bit more than that, to the trailing edge, you can kind of just pull it out and it'll uncover the adhesive residue without having to lift up the skin or anything. It'll just kind of slide out there. And then I can go back in and put Clecos into all the holes as I kind of work my way up and zip this whole thing up. I decided to alternate the Clecos between the left skin and the right skin, just basically trying to get even pressure on both halves of the trailing edge wedge. I don't know if it really matters, but I just did it that way. So now with the trailing edge all sealed up and the internal structure there all Clecoed together, now the spar assembly gets slid into place and the spar gets riveted to each of those shear clips on the inside. This is done using pull rivets. Again, there's just no other way to get in there and do that. So that's a pretty simple process. Now down at the bottom, the other half of the bottom rib, the attached strips and the rudder horn are the next things to get Clecoed and riveted all together. So that was really tough getting this guy up in there. My advice would be don't put this last rivet in on this bottom edge. Leave that one out, and then once you get this in there, when you close up this edge, you could just close that rivet up. Because trying to slide this in there, it was kind of stuck on that rivet. What I ended up having to do once I got this in there was kind of pull down on this and then just hit that with a rubber mallet, and it popped over that rivet. But as you can see, it's scratched up a little bit of the primer there, so I'll just touch that up. Other than that, it's all right. But yeah, it'd be a lot easier to get this guy in there if that rivet's not in the way. So there's a tip. With the bottom done, we'll move up to the top. The counterbalance rib gets attached, and the lead counterweight gets its edges trimmed. When you set it down in there, the shop heads of some of the rivets kind of bump into it, so it can't sit down there flush. So just use the 3M head and just kind of shave down a couple little spots near where the rivets were to make sure you get a nice flush fit of the weight down at the bottom of the counterbalance rib. The weight's then put inside the rib using the screws and the nut plates, and then the top rib can be riveted into place. Because of the very limited clearance, the last 3 rivets out toward the trailing edge of the top rib, those get done using pull rivets. They're special pull rivets that sit down nice and flush with the skin. So they're not as pretty as the normal flush rivets. They have a little hole in them, but they do lay flush to the skin, so not too bad. And then finally, all the remaining rivets between the skin and the spar structure all get riveted in place. So in the next step, we'll close up the trailing edge of the rudder using the process outlined in section 5 of the manual. To do this, we'll use a back rivet plate to set all the rivets in the trailing edge. This will be done in 2 passes as outlined in the manual. On the initial pass, you're going to use the back riveting set perpendicular to the shank head of the rivet, and you're just barely squeezing the rivet down. Basically just enough expansion of the rivet to allow the rivet to replace the Clecos and hold everything in place. But you're still going to have the majority of the rivet head sticking out. Then on the second pass, you start with a back riveting set perpendicular to the shank head, but then as you squeeze down the rivet, you slowly rotate so that you end up perpendicular to the rudder skin, and you'll end up with a nice flush finish on the rivet head itself. Well, so all that's left now is to roll these edges and close it up. How hard can that be? The instructions in section 5 cover how to roll the edges, but basically you take some duct tape and then using a broom handle or PVC, something with about a 3/4 to a 1 inch outside diameter. You basically just tape that to the inside edge, and then you're going to use a lot of downward pressure as you kind of roll up the edge. The idea here is where the skin meets that spar, you don't want to just pull the two leading edges toward each other, because then you'd get a bend right there against the spar. So the reason you're making this curve is so that as the skin comes out away from the spar toward the leading edge, it's nice and straight, and then there's a nice curve that comes after that. So as you're bending the tube, you're holding down pressure against the table surface to keep the skin from bending too close to that grid. Bending the first one is pretty easy, the smaller area. The second two, that's a little bit more challenging because the skins are a little bit bigger and it's a little bit more challenging to get the curve right. Also, bending the first side of the leading edge is pretty easy because there's lots of room to get your fingers in there. But once you've got half of it curved up, it's now a little bit more difficult on the other half to get your fingers up in there and bend this up and then get your fingers back out, because the two halves kind of want to come meet up there. So as you can see, I paid the price for that a little bit.
So there's already been sweat. Now we've got blood. Let's hope for no tears on this build.
And the instructions van provides some templates for each section of this leading edge. And so I just made a copy of that and then cut out the copies so that I could hold them up in place and make sure that I've got the bend just right. And then finally, once the two halves are the right shape and got the holes lined up, blind rivets get put in and squeezed, and that closes up the leading edge. And just like that, you've got a rudder.
So I hope you enjoyed the video. Again, let me know in the comments any feedback that you've got about the build, anything you think I could do differently that might make my life a little bit easier, or anything where you think I'm maybe messing something up. I'm open to all of it. As always, thanks for watching Blue Sky Flight. My name's Bob. We'll see you on the next video.